Okay, so nearly everyone characterizes the design argument as an argument from analogy. Now, the a priori argument that we saw last week, the ontological argument, is an airtight mathematical argument. It either works or it doesn't. There's no middle ground. Whereas an argument from analogy is a probabilistic argument. It's not meant to make an airtight case for the conclusion that there's a designer of the universe, but it's meant to establish that conclusion with a certain degree of probability. And so this is what's pointed out at the beginning here. Again, the conclusion of the design argument is that the author of nature, God, has a mind like a human mind, because if the products of design resemble each other, if things like eyes and ears resemble things like watches and ships and houses, then by analogy, the causes must resemble each other, right? In other words, Paley's argument says, well, the eye is like the watch in having intricate parts that work together to serve a purpose. The watch needed a designer, hence the eye itself needed a designer. And that's not good either. All right, so the idea is that if the author of nature is a designer, then God must have a mind like a human mind. But since the works of nature are considerably more complex than human-made objects, God has larger faculties since the products of design are grander than the products of human design. So the conclusion is that God exists and has an intelligence similar to human intelligence. Now, we saw Cleanthes as one of the characters. He's the intellectual believer. He would be the deist or the very intellectual Christian believer of Hume's day. Whereas Damia is more like the devout, ordinary person on the street. You know, a pretty much fundamentalist believer. And Damia doesn't like a probabilistic argument used to prove God. He does not like it that Cleanthes' argument is what we call a posteriori. It's based on experience and depends on an observed similarity between God and human beings, right? We're intelligent, therefore the deity, the designer of the world, must be an intelligence. And so he says, and he rightly points out that as such, it's only a probabilistic argument. That is, it only, even if it works, it only establishes its conclusion with a certain degree of probability. It doesn't prove it with a certainty that an a priori argument claims to prove its conclusion. So he would long to see something like the ontological argument. But that's not Philo's problem with the design argument. he says, all right, I'm okay with the fact that it's only a probabilistic argument. Because he says there are some good probabilistic arguments. So Philo, remember, Philo is Hume himself. Philo is the skeptical philosopher. So he says it's an analogy that's very weak. He objects that the design argument is not nearly as strong as other probabilistic arguments, that a stone will fall. Was watching a cable show over a friend's house where they were prospecting for minerals, for gems in the mountainous area, and these two prospectors that they were filming were really worried that there's a big stone above them where they were digging that looked precarious, like it was going to fall. And of course, we know what happens when a stone falls, right? Because we've seen that happen before. That fire will burn, or that a match will light, right? I take out another match from the book of matches, I expect it to do the same thing the last one did. Light when I strike it on the striker. And why do I believe it's going to do that? Because I've seen it happen hundreds of times, if not thousands of times. So he says things like whether fire will burn, the earth is solid. There are many duplicatable cases. So he says in arguments where you're comparing exact things, the way we say it today is where you're comparing apples with apples instead of apples with oranges. He says those are strong probabilistic arguments. The exact similarity of the cases assures us of a similar event, right? This match looks like the match I just took out, so I'm sure when I strike it, it's going to light. But he says, look, when we're talking about the universe itself, it isn't like we've got multiple examples to go on. I mean, there was an old joke that professors used to use for a final exam, right, where the question, the first part of the question was describe the universe, and the second part of the question was give two examples. Now that's a final exam that you'd be challenged to complete in 2 hours. Well, I mean, it's a joke because we know that there aren't two examples of the universe. Now, multiverses, it amazes me that serious physicists are talking about multiverses. I studied logics in the 1980s that talked about alternative possible worlds, but none of us really thought that they were around, even though they were presupposed by a particular interpretation of the abstract logic. But physicists today are speculating that there might actually be these alternative universes. But Hume doesn't know that, and as far as he knows, there's only one universe, right? So he says the design argument isn't like these arguments where we can compare many cases. We have only one example of design to go on, the present universe that we're in. So he says the design argument, as it compares other things to the universe, may be comparing very dissimilar things. And this is where he tries to go. Hume assumes that his readers are going to need a little basic logic taught to them, right? And he tries to teach some people the basics of why arguments from analogy work. And they basically work best when Okay, you can set that down there. Hold it. I forgot. We didn't start yet. Just a moment. So he's trying to do some basic education of his reader and explain what makes a good versus a not so good argument from analogy. And so he says, basically, departing from the similarity of the things we're comparing diminishes the evidence that the argument gives for its conclusion. And he says, take a simple example of blood circulation. Suppose we're developing an argument where we say, okay, from observing blood circulation in one human being, we conclude that it circulates in much the same way in another human being. He says it's beyond doubt to conclude that blood circulates in other humans from observation of blood circulation in a human being. But he says, even if we talked about other animals and observing that, when I was, I guess it was in high school biology. I don't know if in biology they ever allowed people anymore to dissect a live frog, and you can see the little heart there beating, and you know that blood is circulating and the heart's beating. And of course they do the frog in because it's after the, but so he says it's only a presumption, but a strong one, to conclude that blood circulates in human beings the way it does in things like frogs and fishes, right? But of course you can go wrong even there, right? Everyone took the test, right? Why do they have human clinical trials before approving a proposed drug from a drug manufacturer? Well, it's because even though the drug has been shown to work and be effective in lab rats or in bunny rabbits, their anatomy isn't exactly like ours. And so the federal government says, you got to do clinical trials with human beings before we approve anything for market, right? We're taught not to give our dogs chocolate because I think they don't have a pancreas or something, or it's different. They can't process it like our bodies can. So just because something works in a rat or a rabbit in the lab doesn't mean the drug is going to be effective in human beings. That's why we need live trials. But Hume does have a point that for some things like blood circulation, even though we're not comparing really similar cases, we're not comparing human beings to human beings, but human beings to frogs, it still works. But now consider this. Now, I can see the barren trees behind you out the window, right? It's still winter. You know what happens. In the fall, the sap with the chlorophyll that the leaves need goes down into the roots, and it stays there until it comes back up again in the spring. That's why the leaves fall off. The point is, you could look at, I don't know if you've ever seen like a corn stalk or some weeds. You cut them, and you can see that there are little tubules that the sap travels through. And Hume knows this, and he says, well, you could make an argument that says, well, okay, Sap goes through little tubules in a plant the same way blood goes through little tubes, the veins and arteries in a human body. Therefore, in a plant, sap must circulate like blood in a human being. But that's wrong. It doesn't circulate. As I said, it goes up in the spring and down into the roots in the fall. Sap does not circulate. So note, he's saying if you're comparing two very dissimilar things, like a corn stalk to a human being, your argument is not very strong, plus it may actually lead you to a wrong conclusion. And of course, Hume, as a skeptic, would think it's a wrong conclusion to conclude that there is an omnipotent designer of the universe, right? So that's lying in the background here. So from similar effects, we can infer similar causes. So he's continuing to make this point, right? I have, and I'm living in a home that I inherited from my parents, right? The paperwork on the house said it was built in 1900. Say, well, that's interesting that it was built in that even exact year. Well, of course, the point of fact is it wasn't built in 1900. We don't know the exact year in which it was built because the records for my home and other older homes in this city were destroyed in the Great Baltimore Fire in the early 1900s. So nobody knows when it was built. And yet, I don't have any problem whatsoever concluding that there must have been a designer and builder of that home. It didn't just grow up from a seed or grow up spontaneously or appear spontaneously one day on that lot. Someone designed it and built it. Why? Because every other house I know needed a designer and builder. So Hume's making this point. He says, on seeing a house, we can conclude with the greatest certainty that it had a builder because other houses we've observed in the past have had builders, so this one must have had one too. Everyone, you took the test, right? That part. Okay, just double checking. Okay, so we can make that point about houses, but he says, is the universe like a house? Or when we compare a manufactured or built item like a house to the universe, are we comparing very dissimilar things? He says the house is very dissimilar, so the presumption of a similar cause would be only a guess, conjecture, presumption. In other words, he's saying that the argument would be like from a corn stalk concluding something about human blood circulation. You're comparing two very dissimilar things. So that's one of Hume's main points. Now, the design argument is a posteriori, that is, it works from actual observations of the world. And one of the things that we are to observe is the order and the adjustment of parts in things in the world to what are called final causes, to purposes, to ends. So Philo and Cleanthes, Philo again is the skeptic, Cleanthes is the intellectual believer, the person who wants a lot of his faith to depend on arguments like the design argument. They both agree that the following things would only be proof of design if from experience we could show that they proceed from it. Order, arrangement, in other words, you look at things in their order, and the adjustment of things to final causes. But he says, apart from experience, a priori, the above could be caused by something internal to matter itself. Now, here's where Hume is writing in probably the 1760s. His book came out after his death in 1776. Remember, he thought it was going to be so controversial, he didn't want it published before he was gone, didn't want to deal with the firestorm of criticism. So, Hume is pretty much relying on the armchair science of his day, right? He's an educated man, but he's not a professional scientist. He's a professional philosopher. So he speculates, though, that maybe, logically, order and adjustment to purposes could come from some forces working inside of things. So he says, for all we know, there could be a material cause of order and not external design from an external artificer. Matter may cause its own order as well as mind can do by design. The elements may fall into some exquisite arrangement by some unknown internal material cause. Now, the example I like to give, I had a little golden book of chemistry when I was in, we called it junior high then, middle school. And it had things that you'd never see in a chemistry book now, right? How to make gunpowder, how to make little explosives out of potassium permanganate. I had a cousin who blew several of his fingers off trying to make a potassium permanganate rocket in his basement. But one of the less controversial things the book had was instructions on how to make rock candy. Anybody ever see rock candy in something like an old general store? Well, what is it basically? Yeah, right. It's whatever your mother wants for her toddler, right? But it's an interesting rainy day project, though. It's basically crystalline sugar. So the way you make it is pretty simple. You dissolve a lot of Domino sugar or some other kind of sugar you heat water on the stove, right? And as you were told in chemistry class, you can dissolve more stuff in if you heat a liquid, right? So you heat it up and you dissolve a lot of Domino sugar into the water, and then what you do to have something that the crystals will form on is you put a ruler or something with a string going down into the water. You let the liquid cool and you get perfectly formed sugar crystals on it. They look like little squares, right? And it looks like those were intentionally designed and cut that way, but it's internal forces that cause the molecules to arrange themselves in that exquisite arrangement. If you've seen quartz crystals, it's the same way. Well, so Hume speculates there might be internal causes of order in matter itself, and we don't have to go outside of it postulating a creator and maker and designer as the cause of this order. He says it's as easy to conceive of that as a conclusion as that God, the divine mind, is the source of such order and arrangement. Now, I say note the similarity to later claims of Darwinism. Now, Hume's writing, as I said, in the 1760s. Darwin doesn't start publishing till the 1840s, right? So Hume's only speculating, but Darwin fills in some of the blanks here, right? I mean, he says his original view of evolution is that it is a blind process that is totally probabilistic, totally random, and did not aim at any goal, much less the goal of producing us. You know, but I mean, take Paley's eye, right? You pretty much know Darwin's story on something like that, right? That over the course of millions of years, organisms adapted to their environment. Some organisms formed advantageous variations, mutations that gave them, and adaptations to their environment that gave them a leg up in the struggle for survival, the evolutionary struggle for survival. And those members of the species survived while the others were eliminated by natural selection. And so over millions of years, you get more and more complex eyes in different organisms until you finally get the eyes we have, not by design, but by the evolutionary forces of nature. Now, what I said with the other class, and my problem has always been, not has always been, but since my high school days when I read a book by Lecomte de Noy called Human Destiny. And there was an argument in there by a scientist. He wasn't an evangelical Christian or anything. He was a scientist. And he tried to calculate. I mean, take the organization in one strand of DNA. He tried to calculate the probabilities against even one strand of DNA coming about by sheer chance. And the probabilities were astronomically against it. So the point is, when you've already got complex organisms capable of adapting to their environment, it's easy, pretty easy to tell the evolutionist story from that as a natural process. But as I said, my problem with evolution as a natural process is, how do you get that first strand of DNA by mere chance? Never mind how you get a complex organism. How do you even get a strand of DNA? So, at any rate, I'm going to move on.
So, quick question. So, with him coming to the synopsis that the strand of DNA is very complex, where is he saying the origination from that DNA strand?
Well, I mean, Hume would again speculate that purely natural forces and chance bring this about.
Are you serious?
You know, as many scientists do today. You know,
is that like the Big Bang?
I mean,
Big Bang?
okay. What you see on the desk is not a briefcase.
Okay.
It's a tournament backgammon set, right? In there are 2 pair of precision dice that cost $25 a pair. We use precision dice because they give you a roll that's what the rules of probability tell you should get, right? But the point is, if you take a random process, like putting 2 precision dice in a shaker, shaking it up and throwing them, if you do it a second time on your next turn, suppose you got a 6 and a 1 the first turn, Well, the odds are, 1 in 36 that you're going to get that the second turn. In other words, an entirely random process, if you wind it up and run it all over again, like putting the dice in the shaker, shaking them up and throwing it, will not necessarily give you the same result. And contemporary evolutionists basically say, hey, yeah, it was a blind natural process. It wasn't aimed at any telos or goal, much less the telos of producing us. And if we ran that whole process through millions of years over again from the beginning, there's no guarantee that it would produce us or anything like us, right? Just like when I shake the dice up again, if I got a 6 and a 1 last time, there's no guarantee I'm going to get a 6 and a 1 this time. But that's the conception of Darwin's original conception of evolution as an entirely natural process. So now, here again, Hume is an educated, I didn't pass around the roll, sorry. If you could pass that around. And we will go over the test. Well, I'd like to do it at the beginning of the period, but if we don't have enough people, we'll have to wait till later in the period next time. I mean, it's good to see you here, but you know what time the class starts. So Hume basically speculates using forces that the average educated person would know as far as the science of Hume's day, science in the late 1700s. Says nature has many causal principles like heat and cold, which we saw in the sugar crystals, attraction or repulsion, and others. And he says design is only one of these forces, and some things in nature may affect others by design, but he says it's illegitimate to reason that everything in the universe is a product of design. It wrongly goes from a part, to a whole. Now, in radio, I had a cough switch. We don't have a quick cough switch here. So that sneeze is now preserved for eternity in the slides. He says it's like drawing conclusions about the generation of a human being from that of a hare. Of course, Hume in his day didn't know about cloning. Now, the interesting thing here, and remember, Paley read Hume. Some people didn't think he did, but he did. I mean, there's stuff out there on the internet that pretty much proves that Paley knew of Hume's arguments against design and wasn't persuaded by them. So Cleanthes anticipates Paley's arguments. He says, well, look, there are millions of examples of design. And that's the thing. Are you comparing more similar things if you're comparing the watch to the eye than if you're comparing the watch to the universe as a whole? Right? So it says the eye has a structure that implies a contriver, meaning a contriver, another word for a designer. And he says that it's the product of design is the most obvious conclusion. Frivolous, abstruse arguments of the skeptic against design are less easily arrived at and less obvious, And Hume doesn't do a good job of discussing, because I did this from the actual text of discussing this. And obviously, you can point to other human organs, like the organs for reproduction, to get other examples that would be similar to the eye, where parts serve functions. Now, he switches ground here, and I'm going to have to go over this fairly quickly, because I want to finish this up. We saw in the slides we looked at last time, Philo believes the world is imperfect, and he says it's a bad logical move to ask us to go from a finite, contingent, imperfect world to the conclusion that the designer of that world is infinite, not finite, perfect, not imperfect. But Philo says, suppose I give the arguer for design the premise they want. Suppose the world were perfect. He said, even if the world were perfect, we couldn't conclude from this that its maker was perfect. My dad was a ship's carpenter, and sometimes when he wasn't on a ship, he was helping to build them. But from the complexity and beauty of the ship, we might form an exalted idea of the ingenuity of the carpenter who made it. But it doesn't mean that just because somebody could do some of the work on a ship that they're capable of designing a whole ship and producing the end product of beauty. He says the carpenter could instead be a stupid mechanic who merely imitated others and copied an art. I mean, look at the graphic on this page, right? Nice looking ship there. Let's back up one, and we see this complex graphic of the eye. And you might want to conclude that the maker and designer of this PowerPoint was a great accomplished artist, who produced these works of beauty, when in fact it was a stupid mechanic of a philosophy professor, but who knows how to cut and paste somebody else's graphic in, right? I have a really impressive website for the Backgammon Club out there. But again, the real artists are the people who design the template. I just put information in it, And so he says we can't necessarily conclude even if the universe is perfect. Now, so the maker need not be perfect. And here's where Hume, you got to understand what Hume's doing here. He's not arguing that these are better conclusions than that the maker and designer of the world is the infinite God of monotheism, of the Bible and church tradition, as Aquinas would have said. He's trying to make the logical point that there's more than one conclusion that's possible from the same assumptions used in the design argument. So he said you could conclude that the world was the latest attempt in a string of botched and bungled worlds, right? The maker could have been an inept but improved over time, like somebody taking their first pottery course and the first vase they try to make looks horrible and misshapen, and so they throw it away and try again. So the maker may not be a perfect God, he says. But he goes even further. Philo says, look, why should we get from the premises of the design argument that the designer of the universe is only one designer, one infinite God? He challenges Cleanthes to show why, on the design hypothesis, there must be only one designer. He says things like houses and ships were built in cooperation by many individuals, right? That building that we just had constructed across the street, that brand new STEM center, you could look out every day and there was a multitude of people working on that building. So he says, why may not several deities cooperate to produce a world or a universe? Then each deity wouldn't have to have the extensive power of an omnipotent God. And he says, look, you could press this thing even further and try to assume that the deities reproduce sexually like the ancient Greeks thought. Remember, Zeus had a father, Kronos. You know, there was a genealogy of the gods. So he says, or why not assert with Epicurus that reason must have human form since no one has seen otherwise? In other words, they said if the gods are rational and we're rational, then the gods must look like us. Seems like a logical conclusion that's wrong. But so Philo says the design hypothesis allows us only to conclude that the universe arose from something like design. Everything else, he says, in one's theology is wide open to fancy. Now, again, and he speculates on other possibilities. And again, it's not that he thinks these are better possibilities, and the last one is the Brahman conjecture that the world was spun by a spider. But he's trying to say that more than one conclusion is possible. So at any rate, this was, for a theologian like Aquinas, right, he's got a book of theology that's 2 inches thick, and his version of the design argument takes up less than a page in that book. I mean, for most theologians, these arguments from natural theology are like icing on the cake. It's nice that they're there, but that's not what the bulk of their faith rests on. But for somebody like Cleanthes, who is portrayed as somebody who doesn't want his faith to rest on things like miracles and revelation and revealed texts, but who puts a lot of stock in intellectual arguments because he wants his faith to be rational, like the design argument, Hume is scoring some real points against somebody like that. Okay, we'll look some at the problem of evil next time, but if we get enough people in here at the beginning of the class, we'll go over the test at the beginning of the class. If I don't get enough people in here, we'll have to wait, because there's no sense going over a test, with not many people there to go over it. But we're on track to be able to do that Wednesday. I have most of the essays finished. I got to run the Scantrons off tomorrow because I forgot to put them in my briefcase Thursday. There's no Scantron machine on campus that I can use. I have to use one at CCBC. Anyway, we'll see you next time, and have a good rest of the day.